Okay, so we're going to now talk about a field of cancer treatment called immunotherapy. So we often, when we talk about cancer treatment, you hear about radiation, you hear about chemotherapy. This is really a new kind of field that is just sort of beginning to be used in pediatric cancer patients. So I'm here with Tom Whitehead, Nancy Goodman, and Timothy Cripe to kind of really dig into this field. And Tom, why don't we start with you, because you really have a personal connection to this as being the father of someone who's one of the first people, or the first child, being treated with immunotherapy for cancer. Can you tell us Emily's story and a little bit about how she got enrolled in the trial and kind of how that process was for her?
Yeah, so Emily was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia just after her 5th birthday. And, you know, we were told at the time that it was the most curable kind of cancer. And if you had to have a kid with cancer, that's the one you wanted to have. And we got started, and she had a rough start, but she did get into remission. And she stayed that way for the first 16 months. And then while still in treatment, she relapsed. And at that point, the protocol was to go to a bone marrow transplant. We tried to do that, and she relapsed again before her donor would come and donate the cells. So at that point, we were kind of out of options. And we transferred from our local hospital down to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And the trial had just opened, so we entered her into the CAR T-cell trial. And we took her cells out after we enrolled her. She stayed in isolation in her room for 6 weeks while they took them off to the lab, and they told her they were going to take them to boot camp and turn them into an army that would come back and fight her cancer. So they gave her cells back in April of 2012, and after she got her cells reintroduced to her system, she got very sick, and she ended up in a coma and put on a ventilator, and she stayed that way for 14 days. And then she finally woke up on her 7th birthday when she came back to us, and that was on May 2nd of 2012. And then 8 days later, they checked her bone marrow, and she is cancer-free.
Wow. And
she remains that way 5 years later.
Wow.
So, yeah, very good.
And how old is she now?
So she's 12, and she just started in 7th grade.
Wow.
And when you see her with her friends, you can't tell anything ever happened to her.
Oh my gosh. And she was 7 when all of this happened?
She actually, she was treated, and she was still 6, and then she woke up on her 7th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And you told me a really interesting story about how you actually found out about this trial or this type of treatment, because it wasn't something that was presented to you by your doctors, right?
No. So my wife did some research, and when she first relapsed, we realized that things aren't going normal, and we decided to go for that second opinion at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But my wife used her research skills to look into the T-cell trial, because we had seen in the news that Dr. June at Penn had treated 3 adults with CLL, with a different type of leukemia. So when we went down for a second opinion about bone marrow transplant, at one point we went back down for another opinion, and they had mentioned it, but we had time where my wife could look into it and research it where we felt comfortable. But we were told that it wasn't going to be ready in time for her. So we didn't know that she would, when they finally told us back at the Hershey Medical Center where we were treating that they just didn't have any more weapons to fight her cancer, and they suggested to give her 1 more round of chemotherapy and take her home in hospice. We paged Dr. Susan Reingold at CHOP, and she actually said, "This is amazing that you paged me today, because the last email I read yesterday was the FDA approval to enter our first child into the T-cell trial."
Wow. So I wanted to dig into why this treatment is so interesting and so different from what has been used to treat cancer in the past. So there's a study recently that found that 70% of the survivors of childhood cancers have a mild or moderate chronic condition. So maybe Dr. Cripe, you can kind of weigh in on why that typically is. Why do these health issues linger? And how is immunotherapy different from some of the more traditional treatments that are used?
Well, the more traditional treatments are very much like a sledgehammer. They don't have very much precision, and they're genotoxic, usually, meaning they damage DNA. So, that's the blueprint of all cells. So they can cause secondary cancers, they can cause damage to tissues. This new therapy, the CAR T therapy, is what they call a living drug. It's an immune therapy, meaning we're harnessing T cells and what they do normally to fight infections, but to turn them around and fight a cancer. So they're not genotoxic, they're not damaging the tissues. They're more precise in terms of only targeting the cancer molecules that have been engineered to do so. So in that way, they're much less, we think, have much fewer toxicities long term. Obviously, the risk of having this kind of treatment, as Emily experienced with, was this so-called cytokine release syndrome, because when you get the immune system so revved up, then it kind of caused collateral damage to her system. But they figured out very quickly how to counteract that. And we don't think there's going to be long-term side effects, but it's too early to know.
And can you kind of just clarify how it works exactly for people who aren't familiar with the sort of inner workings of the body and how the immunotherapy actually works?
Well, so when we talk about immunotherapy, we talk about a lot of different kinds of things. So immunotherapy for neuroblastoma at the moment is using an antibody that targets the tumor. Immunotherapy with CAR T cells is taking one's T cells, which are the normal infection-fighting cells, out and basically redirecting them. So it's also an interesting therapy and a new therapy because it's a gene therapy. They take genes, put them into the cells, grow them up in the lab, put them back in the patient. The gene that they put in is a receptor on the surface of the cell that goes after the tumor. So people are trying to engineer these not just against leukemia, but against solid tumors as well. There's probably other challenges that come into play there because solid tumors are different than leukemia. They have a microenvironment that resists immune therapies, but there's a lot of different kinds of therapies. There's vaccines, there's virus therapies, one that has been approved where we inject a live virus into tumors. So there's a whole plethora, a whole platform of different kinds of immunotherapies under development. So it is very exciting times.
Wow. And Nancy, maybe you can walk us through kind of the journey of how we got to this point with using this treatment in children, actually, and whether, has that been kind of a harder road than maybe treatments for adults?
Sure. So I think the most exciting thing about Emily's story is that she got the drug. And historically, what we've seen, as many of us in the audience know, is that one of the greatest impediments to researchers researching childhood cancers is just getting access to the drugs to study in the first place. And what happened here, which was really exciting, is that Dr. Carl June, who was the scientist developing the CAR T-cell therapy, was a close collaborator with Dr. Steve Grupp, who was a pediatric oncologist. And because of their relationship and their personalities and the quality of their science, they decided to do a pediatric trial very early, and they were able to do it. But that's an anomalous situation. And I think what we see here is it's doable. Even when you have a very novel therapy, you can put it in kids very, very early. We have to remember these kids are, they have no other options. They're very close to hospice, that's their next step. And the result is, Emily's here and she's a healthy, beautiful little girl, and other children are as well. And I hope that as we look at all of these other new exciting immunotherapies, including some, Tim is developing, that we have an opportunity to stick kids on them as early as possible, as early as what is scientifically and medically the right time to do it.
And has the hesitancy there been just that they're so young, maybe they can't handle it, or what has been the reluctance?
It's funny that you ask that because kids tend to tolerate chemotherapies much better than adults. Adults have a lot of other diseases, comorbidities, as we say, other challenges. And so in general, we can go to higher doses, we can be more aggressive with kids than we can with adults. It's not a very well-known fact. So pediatric oncologists tend to be much more aggressive with their treatments than adult oncologists.
Yeah. And just as a sort of personal way to think about this, so my son died of cancer. Jacob died almost 8 years ago. And when he was really in the end stages of cancer, I looked at 8 different therapies that were in development for adult cancers. Right. And none of these therapies were available for children at the time. And there was some early preclinical evidence that they should be studied in children. Maybe they wouldn't have helped Jacob. But the fact is, just a few of these drugs now, just like in the last year, pediatric trials have opened. That's 7 years of kids who haven't had a shot at these drugs that were considered worthy of study in adult cancers. And so, why are we leaving our kids behind like this? The
other frustration with that is if the drug fails an adult trial, the company may kill the drug. And so then it's not available, even if it might work for a pediatric
Yeah.
type of tumor. So we're losing out in that way too.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, 95% of all drugs are abandoned between phase one, and the approval process.
Well, and I wanted to talk about the cost. There was an article recently that the drug Kymriah cost something like $500,000. And of course, that's the cost before your insurance kicks in and whatever might be available to you. Can you talk about your experience with getting this treatment paid for, what you had to go through, and kind of, maybe others can weigh in on what is sort of the bigger picture, the hurdles to families getting this drug that is really quite expensive?
Well, I'll start off by saying, at that time, I told him, if you can save our daughter, you can have whatever we have. There's no price you put on your child. But we were very fortunate that we lived within Pennsylvania, and Emily was treated in Philadelphia, so there was some state grant money. And being in an experimental trial, a lot of those costs were absorbed by the grant money that they had. But it still was very expensive. And we were very fortunate that a lot of people supported us and did fundraisers for us. And I tell people now, during that time, I just felt, a strong sense to ask for prayers for Emily, and that's all we ever asked for. And if you didn't pray, send your positive thoughts. And that turned into fundraisers and that kept us afloat during that time. So we always had enough money to eat and take care of the bills that weren't paid. So we were very fortunate. But again, I think looking back, when they told us she needed a bone marrow transplant, we were told, that the cost of the transplant is covered under your insurance, but the search to find a donor is around $150,000, and that's not covered.
Wow.
So I think from what I know about it is it's about the same cost as what a bone marrow transplant would be, and for the children that have been able to get in the trial, it's been more effective.
I mean, if you think about the cost, it's a one-time treatment.
Right.
So a lot of drugs that are very expensive are given routinely, weekly, monthly.
Right.
So this is a one-time treatment, and what's been set up now, which is a very attractive model, I think, is that the patients don't get charged unless it works.
Okay.
So that's kind of a new twist on drug development. So that's very interesting.
Jacob's medical costs were $2 million.
Yeah. Is there, kind of just alongside this cost issue, but just other regulatory hurdles, what has the U.S. government already done to facilitate these therapies being available to children, and what else needs to be done in order to help more parents like you?
One of the challenges we don't know about in terms of the science, which of the immunotherapies in adults are going to work in kids. So I think immunotherapy, as I mentioned, is a lot of different things. I think of them as two different arms. One, trying to activate your own immune system, and the other is to just utilize immune molecules like CAR T cells. So the drugs that have been really successful in adults recently have been the checkpoint inhibitors, and that's a way that you're activating your own immune system that already pre-exists against a tumor that's seen as foreign, but just the immune system suppressed. So it's a way to unleash what's already there. We think that that'll be helpful in some children, like those with very high mutation rates in their tumors, so-called mismatch repair types of tumors. But the majority of pediatric cancers arise differently from adult cancers. They're probably abnormal development. They're epigenetic, meaning changes in gene expression, as opposed to acquisition of different mutations over many, many years. So they may not be seen as foreign or as foreign as adult cancers are. So some of those immune therapies may not work for children. We have to try, and we have to look at them and try to figure out which ones are most likely to work. But we need to have the regulatory burdens lifted. We need to have more funding, way more funding toward pediatric cancers, and specifically both in the preclinical stages as in the clinical stages, so we can figure all these things out.
I think, as a parent, it's tough to see that Emily had this success, and now it's the first time they got an FDA approval in pediatrics before adults. And there's parents all over the world right now, waiting for better, less toxic treatments for their children. And these doctors that all have great ideas and want to move it forward aren't being funded. So our goal is to continue in a positive manner, trying to bring them in more funding and allow them to, treat the kids and and maybe we can have some more breakthroughs with children first before adults.
One strategy we've pursued at Kids versus Cancer is to create incentives and requirements for companies to undertake pediatric studies. So just last month, actually, Congress passed a law, which was signed by the president, that requires companies developing cancer drugs and biologics to also undertake pediatric studies. And so the hope is that if there are immunotherapies for adult cancers that would be appropriate, and that, Dr. Tim Cripe wants to study in kids, that there's now increased leverage on his part to get access to these drugs and really determine whether they're valuable for kids. Mm-hmm. The second law that we drafted and were successful in advocating for passage of by the US Congress is the Creating Hope Act Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program. And what that program does, and that was in 2012, and what that program does is it gives a financial incentive for companies to develop drugs expressly for kids with cancer or other rare and life-threatening illnesses. And if they do so, they get vouchers that are now trading. It's a cap and trade kind of program, and these vouchers are trading for hundreds of millions of dollars. Wow. So the incentives
Nancy's done fantastic work. That really deserves a round of applause, because that makes a big difference. It's huge.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for some questions, if you guys have questions. No questions? Really? Oh, wait, no. There are, back there.
Good morning. My name is Françoise Bissay. I'm a doctoral student at George Mason University. So I do have a question on immunotherapy. Are there some cases, some cancer cases, where immunotherapy is ever the first-line treatment?
Well, I think that's the ultimate goal. We want to bring treatments up to first line that are non-toxic and effective. So ultimately, we'd love to get rid of bone marrow transplant. We'd love to get rid of chemotherapy. We'd love to get rid of radiation. I mean, we've made a lot of advances using those treatments, and so we can't abandon them right away. But if we could replace them over time with things that are more effective and less toxic, that would be fantastic. There are, in the past, when immunotherapies have been the front line, it's because there was nothing else. And at that point, immunotherapies didn't work very well. At the moment, I would say I can't think of any example where that's something we use as a first line or as an only treatment, but that would be the goal.
I'm not sure.
I'm Julie Byrne. I'm with the Boyne Research Institute in Ireland, and I'm part of a large collaborative in Europe looking at the long-term consequences of treatment for cancer during childhood. So we are doing largely retrospective studies looking at standard therapies, radiation and chemotherapy. But I'm just wondering, what are the plans, if any, in place to follow children who've been treated with these new agents? This is a question for Dr. Cripe as well as for Dr. Seibel, who's no longer with us, and with regard to the NCI's MATCH program too.
That's a great question. I think long-term side effects that are very important that we understand and we mitigate as best as we can, and so to learn what they are is the first step. The company that got the CAR-T approval is required by the FDA to monitor patients for 15 years based on some rules that are in place for any gene therapy that could potentially modify the patient's DNA. So that is something they'll be doing at least for that long a time, and they put into place as part of their FDA approval monitoring plan. I think it's going to behoove the regulatory agencies like that to make sure that companies that bring new therapies to bear look at that. What I've always said in developing our products and also with targeted therapy is, if we can monitor patients that long, great. We'll do all we can, because at this point those patients aren't there 15 years later. So we'd be happy to do whatever it takes. I think one of the challenges when you get a grant to study something, that grant ends in 3 to 5 years. So to have funding in place 15, 20, 30 years later to make sure you monitor them is going to be up to other sources of funding to make sure that we're still doing that at that time.
Just to follow up on your question, Julie. So there is a study being done through the Children's Oncology Group looking at the late effects related to dinutuximab and neuroblastoma. And we hope we have the opportunity to study the late effects from those children who are being treated on pediatric match. But this is always a goal in any treatment to include the late effects.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Michael Carlin, and I'm with IBEX Biosciences. And my question is, for a startup company that we were producing certain molecules that look like they have both uses for adult cancers and pediatric cancers, and we're in the very early steps, what advice would you give to pursue the pediatric route as well as the adult route at the same time and not hold them back? So that's a challenge that we kind of have as we're looking at research literature. There's some good literature on pediatric cancer with some of the molecules are working as well as adult cancer. So at the very early stage, I was wondering if you have any suggestions or advice on that.
My suggestion scientifically is to make sure that you identify which kinds of cancers it may work in and get some good preclinical data to back that up. But secondly, to work with bona fide groups of pediatric oncologists to figure out how to best integrate that into the clinical side in terms of phase 1 studies and beyond. And that would be, with leaders in COG or disease-specific teams or experts in the field to make sure that you've got them on board so that when you do roll it out, it makes sense because usually we'll have to integrate these with existing treatments.
I'll also just add, of course, once you undertake the scientific analysis to determine that it's appropriate to study a pediatric cancer first, from a business perspective, it's very inexpensive compared to adult studies because accrual fees are like $5,000 per child, which is very low compared to adult studies. Traditionally, FDA has been looking at very small trials in pediatric cancer space and approving drugs on trials of trial size that are quite small, say 50, 60 kids. There have been several drugs. Kids don't have comorbidities like adults do. So in some ways, it's a lot easier to do kids. That's my pitch from a business perspective. And then there are these series of physicians like Dr. Tim Cripe who have put together consortiums where they take a lot of the responsibility for regulatory requirements and accrual requirements, data collection.
Yeah.
The other thing I might add is if you can impact a child, you can impact an entire lifetime. So.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely an exciting field. Thank you so much, Nancy, Tom, and Timothy. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.